When the Systematic Theology was first published in 1994, I remember one of my faculty colleagues at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Illinois saying, "Wayne, nobody's going to buy this book because the section on spiritual gifts is too sympathetic to the charismatic movement and the continuation of miraculous gifts. So the Reformed people won't buy it because of the spiritual gifts section, and the charismatics won't buy it because it's too Reformed. So who's going to buy it?" But as it turned out, I think by God's grace I was able to treat each position that I disagreed with fairly and honestly and accurately, so that people at least felt, even though I disagreed with them, I was fairly representing their positions. Part of that was teaching 20 years at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School with students from all over the world and various denominational backgrounds. I couldn't get away with misrepresenting the Lutheran position on baptism, for instance, because the Lutheran students would object in class. And I couldn't get away with misrepresenting the Arminian position on predestination because the Arminian students would correct me. And so it was with spiritual gifts, and the charismatic students and the cessationist students really helped me a lot in the years that I lectured on this material before it actually came out in a book. Sometimes the question comes up, why don't people study theology more? Why are people so theologically ill-informed in our churches? And I think some of the reasons that people give are they think theology is hard to understand, or they think it's boring, or they think it doesn't really affect their lives. But I would encourage someone to take this Systematic Theology Revised Edition. It has 57 chapters, but think of it as 57 small books. If you just want to read the chapter on prayer, then read that. If you just want to read the chapter on the Trinity, then read that. If you want to read the chapter on sanctification, read that, or on the second coming of Christ. And I think you'll find, number one, that the chapter is not boring. Number two, it's not hard to understand. And number three, at the end of each chapter, there are real practical applications to life. So I think that the book sort of persuades readers, if they'll just open it, that it is worthwhile. I would say also that part of the readability is that my target audience was not other professors of theology, because if I'm writing a technical academic article to persuade other professors, I can use a lot of specialized vocabulary that they understand. I can quote Greek and Hebrew words untranslated and assume that they'll understand them, but you can't do that with an introductory text. You need to be aware of what the students haven't learned before and bring them along with you in understanding the technical terms that are used in theology. And I taught introductory theology classes at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for many years and now at Phoenix Seminary. So that's the primary audience. I'm picturing myself in a classroom with students who don't have any background in theological terminology or study of theology. But I also imagined that my parents were in the back of the classroom. My dad went to 2 years of college. My mom wasn't able to attend college when she was growing up. And so, but they've been Christians their whole lives and read their Bibles their whole lives. And I thought I wanted them to be able to understand it too. So it's written for, I would say, thinking adult Christians. Although I know some high school students who have studied it and learned from it as well. Every chapter follows the same structure. There's a discussion of the doctrine being discussed, such as justification or the Trinity or the deity of Christ. And then there is an explanation of where that doctrine is supported in Scripture and objections that might be raised to it. And then after that, there are questions for personal application and a list of special terms that students in a class would need to know for their growth in understanding of theological terms. There's a scripture memory passage. There's a bibliography of other literature on this topic. And then there's a scripture memory verse. And at the end, there's a hymn, because I think it's important to worship God as well as talk about Him. Well, the first question that people ask is, have I changed my mind on anything? And the answer is very little, but three things come to mind. First, on the question of the translation of the word that in the King James is only begotten. The Greek word is monogenes. In the light of overwhelming new evidence that's been discovered and written up in academic journals, I now believe it should be translated only begotten as opposed to only, and that affects John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. So it looks to me like the weight of scholarship is shifting back toward restoring that original word. And then the question, of course, is what does it mean? And I talk about that. Second thing is, on the impassibility of God, I didn't, in the first edition, put in the possible definition, God is not able to be harmed. And I just overlooked that, and I've included it in the second edition as an attribute of God. The third thing is, in the first edition, I came out mostly undecided on whether the Earth is 10,000 or 20,000 years old or 4.3 billion years old. And in light of just massive amounts of new evidence, it seems to me that the argument in favor of an old Earth is much stronger, and I've concluded that an old Earth is the position that I hold. That would be a 4.3 billion year old Earth and a 13.8, I don't have the decimal, billion year old universe. What are some of the things that have been added to the book? Well, a couple of things. All the bibliographies in all 57 chapters have been updated with more recent literature. All the Bible quotations have changed from the RSV to the ESV. I've added a contemporary worship song at the end of each chapter. In addition to the hymn, I kept the hymns, which people appreciate. But I find that students in my classes don't really know the older hymns very well. So we added a contemporary worship song. And then I added a section on the differences between evangelical Protestant beliefs and Roman Catholic beliefs, with extensive quotations from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I've added a section on the difference between Protestant evangelical belief and Mormonism. And then I have a section on the differences between evangelical beliefs, and Protestant liberalism, which is what students encounter in secular university classes when they take Bible courses or theology courses. So there are some charts or detailed lists that lay out those differences. In the Doctrine of Scripture, I have added more what people sometimes call problem verses for inerrancy, and suggested the way I would resolve the question of apparent conflicts in the Gospels between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, for instance. I give a couple of hard cases and say, this is how I would see a solution, so there's no contradiction. But I thought those were helpful kind of paradigm cases to talk about. The chapter on the clarity of Scripture, I've made more clear. I revised it substantially, and I think it's a more accurate and faithful and perhaps somewhat new approach to the clarity of Scripture. I've added quite a bit of material on answering open theism, the idea that God doesn't know future human choices. I added an entirely new section on the new perspective on Paul, the different view of justification that has become popular and which I think is incorrect and not faithful to Scripture. The creation and evolution material is completely updated with massive amounts of new evidence, especially research done and promoted by the Discovery Institute in Seattle and Hugh Ross and Reasons to Believe in California. The evidence for intelligent design is, again, I think, very weighty. I have a section there discussing the idea of theistic evolution, which I'm convinced cannot be reconciled with Scripture, the theory that God used evolutionary processes without altering the natural behavior of matter until all living things had evolved by purely natural means. Now, the theistic evolution person will say, but God guided it that way, but they won't allow for any guidance that changed the behavior of matter. A revised section on the role of women in the church, revised and updated section on spiritual gifts, and added section on worship music, which is a controversy today. Updated sections on God's atemporal eternity, updated section on the eternal submission of the Son to the Father, taking into account recent controversies. A discussion of seeker-sensitive churches, a discussion of Molinism or middle knowledge. I interact with and critique the preterist view that Christ already returned in 70 AD, which I don't think is true. We have, my research assistants and I have indexed the topics in 21 additional systematic theology books that have been published since my book came out in 1994. It's amazing the proliferation. It's a healthy thing for the church, the proliferation of different perspectives on systematic theology. I could add also that the editors at Zondervan tell me that the word count in this revised edition of Systematic Theology is 14% longer than the original version. And I'm thankful that they're willing to include that material. And then there are just many, many other small tweaks and changes. I've been teaching through this book for the last 25 years. And every year, students bring up new insights or new objections or questions. And those become incorporated into lecture notes, and eventually they've found their way into this revised edition of Systematic Theology. So I'm excited about the updates that are included and excited about the new edition coming out. One of the encouraging things that I've heard about the book is that some churches use it for leadership training. I just heard today about a pastor at a large church who, when he wants to train new elders, he'll have them work through the book a chapter at a time. And I know of one church that had 800 people read through this book a chapter at a time and discuss it then. So when I see that happening with ordinary lay persons who are Christians, not just pastors and not just academic people, reading the book and finding help for their Christian lives, I'm very grateful to the Lord for that blessing. If you would like to learn the doctrinal teachings of the Bible in summary form on 57 different topics, I encourage you to get this book.